нас, к сожалению, история знает отвратительно. We had also our battles. There's nothing you can do, except pray.
Russia continues to rewrite European history.
В японском фильме о Нанкине военных преступников назвали мучениками. Литва обвинила Россию.
A little less than a century has passed since the outbreak of World War II, but now the story of the war looks a little different. In Europe, they are arguing who started this deadly car rolling, Hitler or Stalin, referring to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the Munich Treaty as an example. But all of these people forget about other participants of the global armed conflict who said that World War II has affected only the West. According to some historians, the war began long before 1939 and not in Europe. July 7th, 1937, the Japanese invaders started to shoot Chinese soldiers without any warning under the arches of the Marco Polo Bridge. At that moment, World War II began, says Rana Mitter, a professor at Oxford University.
So the first few years, I would say from 1937 to 1941, you could call the years in which China fights almost alone. The 8 years of destruction that were visited on China, which caused the country to almost collapse through corruption, black marketeering, all of that.
The Japanese were quickly advancing in China. A week after their appearance in China, Beijing fell. In August, the invaders landed in Shanghai. At that time, a large-scale transfer of forces from the center of the country to defend the city began. The Danish journalist Peter Harmsen called this battle Stalingrad of the Yangtze. The scenes of flattened housing complex and gutted factories that were later to captivate and horrify the global public. During the Battle of Stalingrad had in fact already played out more than a few years earlier in China's largest city. It would seem Stalingrad and Shanghai are situated in different ends of the world. What can unite these two seemingly different cities? Shanghai is the largest metropolis not only in China, but also in the world. Located in the delta of the Yangtze River, the main seaport, the Japanese needed this city as an important strategic point. They wanted to press the enemy to the water, as the German army would do the same in Stalingrad a few years later.
If you look at it overall, if you look at the importance, the symbolic value of the battle, then I think there are similarities. First of all, the sheer scale, the scale of the Battle of Stalingrad was, of course, unprecedented.
Stalingrad was subjected to massive carpet bombing, which lasted about 7 days. Up to 2,000 sorties by German air forces took place daily, carried out by German bombers. At some moments, up to 80 planes could be observed in the air carpet bombing. 45 minutes of continuous bombing, 10 to 15 minutes for the break, and so on. Civilians, of course, rushed about searching for the shelter in this hell. But no further than in 1941, civilians were evacuated from Leningrad and other occupied territories to the rear of Stalingrad. As a result, the population of the city on the river Volga doubled in a matter of months, up to 800,000 people. When battles broke out in the streets, civilians were taken on. It's hard to say how many evacuated people survived, as well as to count those killed in the most bloody battle of World War II. More than 34,500 soldiers were buried only on Mamayev Kurgan. They rest in a large mass grave under the statue the motherland calls. The burial appeared after fighting ceased at an altitude of 102 meters, but there is still another small grave. Soldiers of the 62nd Army commanded by Marshal Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov were buried there. According to one version, the courageous image of the protective warrior is written off from him. try and call an artillery strike on top of your own commander who is sitting in a dugout and the Jerrys want to take him alive. We had to do this. According to Nikolai Chukov, the 62nd Army of his legendary grandfather got the most of the fighting. The unit was closely pressed to the Volga and the Germans rammed ahead. Immediately, the command followed. Reduce the distance between the trenches up to 50 meters. In fact, you were looking the enemy in the face. Throughout his life, Vasily Chuikov has looked in the face of the enemy more than once, first in China and then at home. On the eve of World War II, he was sent to China as an advisor to Chiang Kai-shek. Chuikov was not only to teach the Chinese to fight, but also to reconcile the leaders. As such, there was no unity of command in the army. Each of them did what they could. And Chuikov had such a difficult task. After all, a civil war was breaking out at the time. How to stop the upcoming civil war was the question. Mao Zedong was going to take revenge for 10,000 executed communists. In total, 236 advisors went to China. We still hear many of their names. We just don't know that their past goes back to China. The commander of the Red Army was a significant person. He fought. Chiang Kai-shek favored him, awarded him with one of the highest orders of the Republic of China. Stalin gave him the Order of Lenin. Up to the year of 1942, Andrei Vlasov was a national hero. After the Moscow counterattack, he was called the savior of the capital, but 3 months later, Stalin corrected one of the newspaper headlines. Former Soviet General Vlasov turned out to be a lackey and a German spy. Vlasov was and remains a despicable traitor. What a terrible weather! Chinese army, take cover! Carefully. Squadron leader, there is a position. We can flank him to avoid unnecessary casualties. The Japanese killed everyone who got in their way. The brutal massacre began in the morning. The Japanese roamed the streets and continued to kill until they destroyed everyone. After that, they dug a giant pit into which the corpses were thrown. In terms of cruelty, the Japanese invaders hardly differed from the German Nazis or Italian fascists. The ultimate sport for them was to decapitate a person with a blow of the sword. These skills the invaders honed in Nanjing on December 13, 1937. Professor of Oxford University, Rana Mitter, shows a memorial to the victims of the Nanjing massacre in his film, World War II, China's Forgotten War. This memorial was built on the site of a mass grave.
3 different groups of Japanese soldiers led the assault on Nanjing. Once the onslaught had begun, the Japanese conquered quickly, and the Chinese defense was crushed. But affected by battle weariness and enraged by Chinese resistance, the occupiers made Nanjing pay the price in blood.
According to official statistics, 300,000 of soldiers and civilians were killed as a result of the incident, as it is called in history. The Chinese philosophy says that China will never perish. And war is just a disease, and like any other disease, it goes away. The Chinese could sacrifice millions of their citizens and ultimately win. I remember during one of the battles, we failed, and everyone decided to leave the field, to retreat. Then I asked to speak. I was allowed to express my opinion, although I was very young. I said, if we don't have an opportunity to fight back the enemy, why can't we reconsider the tactics? We cannot resist the bombing of the enemy. We do not have enough equipment. It will be harder for us. On the plain, the Japanese are destroying us from the air, so I propose to stay in the mountains. There, the Japanese will only have infantry. Bombers will not pass.
We lay down But by 12 o'clock it was so hot, you couldn't touch the stones next to you. We were very fortunate. Nobody got killed.
The Republic of South Africa, and then it was the South Africa Union, declared war on Germany along with Great Britain. Mobilization began, and despite the fact that the Boers had a lot of militaristic approach in their tradition, there were not so many people to be involved. The racial question arose: what to do? Because as we know, there is the white, black and colored population in Africa. There isn't enough white population for the South Africa Union to perform properly in the theater of war. They began to engage the black population. The Zulus of South Africa, they're famous for their good command of weapons. They have strong military traditions. About 1 million soldiers left the continent to the front as volunteers, and 19-year-old Sydney Island was among them. Today, he is drinking tea in the shade of foliage on the porch of his house in Cape Town and recalls dying of thirst almost 80 years ago in East Africa.
I always remember that there was a well there. There was no drinking water, but they had a well. And it shot a donkey and threw the donkey in the well. And the engineers, they got stuck in and took the donkey out, and we had fresh water for drink eventually, yeah.
Sydney Island doesn't like to remember the hardships of those years. He says too many years have passed since that time.
Father never spoke about it.
Yeah.
I think we actually were totally unaware of his past, his army and going to war. And the only reason why we've become more involved is my dad moved in with me after my mum died. And the children, my kids were really interested. And my father started to open up a bit more about his life and the war here.
It's only a dot on the map of France. A little less than 300 kilometers from Paris is only 10 kilometers to the border of Belgium, the port city of Dunkirk. Here, in late May, early June, Indian soldiers faced the war. They fled from the advancing Wehrmacht tanks, along with the British, Belgians, and the remnants of the French army.
He's coming back round. He's coming back round!
But neither the film of Christopher Nolan nor Wikipedia remembers anything about participation of fighters from Asia. India itself does not remember.
We did study the Second World War, but only very minimally. It was very much presented as a European war, nothing to do with China or Russia or South Africa, certainly nothing to do with the colonies at all.
2 years after the end of the war, India became independent. And after independence, there was also partition, so the war did not have that kind of an impact. The freedom movement and our independence struggle, that became more important than the war itself. People do know about it, but they know about bits and pieces of it.
Just like the Indian army also fought, partly in Europe, partly in Africa, partly defended its borders. India sent 2.5 million volunteer soldiers to the front of World War II. We fought side by side with African soldiers. There were a lot of Africans in our unit, and the rest were various ethnic groups of India. The Chinese also fought on our front, but I didn't meet them.
Yes, when we left Mombasa on our way to Egypt, we stopped at a place called Berbera in Somaliland. When we got onto the shore, we discovered there was an Indian regiment already there. They had taken part in the battle for Tada and Somaliland. We became very friendly, and the Indians actually invited us over for supper.
The only interaction that we had with Russia during the war was the Indian army was involved in running these supply convoys through Iran into Russia.
Two Indian soldiers were awarded the Orders of the Red Star by Soviet government in July 1944. Among the most distinguished Indians were Senior Lieutenant Subedar Narayan Rao Nikam and Sergeant Havildar Ganjendra Singh. They were awarded for the successful completion of tasks in transporting weapons, materials and food to the Soviet Union. How could India, a poor country, help? The fact is that in the first year of war in India, a very powerful military economic mobilization took place. That is, the production of tanks, machine guns and arms began there. African people are sharp-witted. Indeed, a lot of weapons were adapted to the needs and requirements because the speed of logistics was not enough for delivery and supply of armaments, so everything was adapted to be used in the theater of war. There was no one else like South African soldiers in the desert. It accounted for 90% of the geography of the entire North African theater of war. It was extremely difficult to fight in a desert because of the absence of water, working navigation systems, because of the specific climate and terrain. Therefore, strategic points were located on the Mediterranean coast.
The Allied forces from the east, fighting from Egypt, and you had the German and Italian forces from the west, fighting from Tunisia and Libya. Tobruk was an important harbour in the middle, and whoever controlled that port could control supplies that came through to the frontline soldiers.
But the siege was unsuccessful for the South Africans. They lost a whole division. A third of the soldiers were captured. An interesting fact is that the second language of the white population in South African Union, Afrikaans, is based on the Old Dutch language, very similar to it. And the Germans gave certain privileges to those South Africans. And South Africans, in turn, recalled the help of the Russian Empire in the Boer War, remembered this story, and helped their colleagues, Russian brothers, and sometimes even fed them. There are a lot of stories that the Russians were deprived of food. The prisoners were starving when the South Africans helped. I'm dying, but not giving up. This is an inscription on the wall of one of the battlements of the Brest fortress. Bodyguards, Red Army soldiers, and command staff families were among the first to defend the homeland. The soldiers began to battle half-dressed. No one had expected a surprise attack. Unfortunately, we do not know our history. We have literally forgotten everything, despite all our patriotic statements that no one has been forgotten and nothing had been forgotten. One single well-known episode is the Brest Fortress. It happened so that there were about 3,500 personnel there, units of 2 rifle divisions, a border detachment, and a battalion of NKVD troops. And so, they fettered at least a German division with tanks, artillery, which was much stronger, and held it for about a month. Individual resistance lasted even longer. Firefights, people were fighting among the ruins. They were attacking, which puzzled the Germans, because they were so far in the rear without information about what was happening in the war, but they still continued to fight. Everyone stood up to the defense of the Soviet Union, from young to old. To learn more about the smallest soldiers, we went to the rear, to the region of Ivanovo. A little more than 300 kilometers on the express train Lastочка. We got there in less than 4 hours from Moscow. 21 Chinese children were evacuated from Moscow orphanage via the same route in 1941. Students from China, Europe, Brazil and Africa have survived the war years here, and here we can see unique photographs and documents, and this is the reason we came here. History here lives on not only in a museum or in an archive, but memories are also stored in the walls of the orphanage. The personal files of the pupils are recited by heart by the head of the museum, Sofia Kuznetsova. She's been reenacting the history of the Interdom, bit by bit, for over half a century. To Belarusians, Bulgarians, Brazilians, here she is. It is believed she was a beloved girl that supposedly Fritz wrote to. He was a friend of Serezha or Mao Nanjing, the son of great helpsman Mao Zedong. He got into Interdom in 1936 and fell in love with a Brazilian girl, Moody Lacerda. Then the war began. He had to forget about his feelings. Sergei tried to get to the front, even wrote several letters to Stalin. Dear comrade Stalin, I am a young Chinese man in the Soviet Union, ruled by you. I have studied for 15 years. I love the USSR as much as I love China. I cannot watch German fascists trample over your country. I want to avenge the millions of dead Soviet people. I'm determined to go to the front. Please, support my request. Serezha's letter will never receive an answer, but he will eventually get to the front. He will fight in Poland and Czechoslovakia and will meet victory in Berlin. Memorial plaque, eternal glory to the dead. Here we can see the name of Wang Li. This is a boy who was not even 10 years old when he died. He escaped from the German-occupied children's pioneer camp in Belarus. How did he get there? Together with 20 other Interdom students, he went to a recreation camp near the village of Novoyelnaya for the summer holidays. The place was called Belarusian Art. According to the planned program, children only managed to spend a few nights on the new mattresses, carefully laundered sheets, and went for a walk in the morning when fascist planes appeared over the camp. And in an instant, from a health camp, turned into a concentration camp. Zhu Dezumin, the daughter of the leader of the Chinese Revolution, the closest ally of Mao Zedong, was among the captives. She witnessed the children being killed, shot, buried alive in the ground. A terrible epic in the camp. There are photos of one of the merry fascists, even photographing her with other students. Here they are, the 3 Interdom students that ended up in the camp. In June 1941, 5 children decided to flee the camp to Moscow. On the way from Novogrudok to Minsk, they came under fire and got lost. Only Igor Astafyev and Van Lee Ismailov remained together. Pupils were hiding in abandoned houses for several days, gradually moving east. But in the vicinity of Borisov, Van Lee fell behind, and Igor Astafyev was afraid to return for his comrade. The boy heard a cannonade of fascist shots. Wang Li was never seen again. It seems to me, when the fireworks are rattling, the dead from the envelopment rise up. They walk to the Neva, to the river, along the streets, among the living, but they're not singing. In 1942, people began to die of starvation. The situation was so much deteriorated. People were eating everything, even belts, leather belts. This was a delicacy. Many didn't survive, died of dyspepsia because their bodies were not made for this. My cousin was among them. He also died. My aunt cooked jelly from wood glue. She was fine, but he had a terrible stomach upset. So he died of starvation. He was 13.
У нас тоже вот от голода. 13 лет ему было.
If we move 6,000 kilometers to the border of India and China, to a state that used to be called Burma, we'll face the same situation. This territory was occupied by the Japanese. That was the main cause of why people didn't receive food. According to various estimates, 3 million people died of hunger.
We never thought about the famine in terms of war. So food is shipped out from the country over and over again. And because food therefore gets so expensive, people cannot buy it.
The Eastern Road of Life also passed there. It connected Myanmar with China. This was the main source of the American assistance to block China. But already in April 1942, Japan was to take over this territory, and it will turn into a road of death. But before that, Brazil will declare war on Germany.
Brazil and Russia were two countries attacked without advice by the Nazis. Of course, the Russians suffered much more, the millions of lives, and Brazil suffered also. But only one life is important.
The Brazilian division was not formed immediately. 25,000 soldiers, some hundreds of women, nurses, and a squadron of 50 combat aircraft. Latin Americans will send to the front only 2 years later. There was such a saying that a snake would rather light a pipe than the expeditionary Brazilian division would fight in Europe. This symbol appeared on the chevrons of Brazilian soldiers, on the hulls of military aircraft, and even on guns. I will wear medals. When I speak to the camera, everything should be neat. Wait, there they are. Senor Melchizedek Alfonso Carvalho was sent to the front as a cabin boy. He calls himself a scout. After all, he had to patrol warships in the waters of Atlantic. We patrolled the territory from Rio de Janeiro to Trinidad and Tobago, then Dakar in Africa, and returned to Brazil. We had a mixed patrol. They were our ships, along American ships. When we arrived in Trinidad, the Americans replaced us. They sailed back to the USA and England. There was a ferry, a large supply of raw materials which Brazil sent to the United States and Europe. And this is why German submarines appeared there.
The Atlantic is a terrible place. It's always rough there. When I say rough, it's huge seas running, weather terrible. It was North Atlantic. It was really bad. Our ship was 1,700 tons, which is small. And, you get into those seas, there's nothing you can do. Except pray.
A lot of prayer.
17-year-old young man Joe Wilkinson joined the British Navy as a volunteer after one of his brothers went missing in the Burman jungle. He sailed to the Soviet Murmansk as part of the Arctic convoys.
You understood that if you'd fallen overboard in the Arctic Sea, I think you had something like 30 seconds before you were frozen.
In total, during the war years, more than 1,000 ships passed through the Arctic route in both directions. 87 of them were destroyed by German submarines. Joe Wilkinson still remembers the homing German Zunkonik torpedoes swarming around his patrol ship. The sailors called them Gnats. Despite the speed and maneuverability of underwater mines, the team of the South African veteran managed to sink 4 fascist submarines in less than 2 weeks. It was a real feat for which the crew received an award from British King George VI.
King George VI came on board, Queen Elizabeth, and believe it or not, they took her onto the bridge, and the back of her frock was covered in grey paint. The paint hadn't dried. She'd obviously leaned against it, but anyway, nobody told her about it. King George, a fantastic man, he had a word with everybody.
At that time, South Africa was already aware of the defeat of the Red Army in Stalingrad. The expression Stalingrad tactics had become a famous quote in the opposite end of the world. Today, it is used in many newspapers and magazines. It means to resist anything stubbornly, at every step, in all possible ways. You feel fear when 30 junkers, bombers, are on their runs, and you don't know where the mines will fall. They come around on the first run, the second run. Konstantin Sharov was born on November 19th. Later, this date will be called Day of Missile Forces and Artillery, in honor of the counter-offensive of the Soviet Army near Stalingrad. This is hardly a coincidence. What should we do at night time? Will we send the sentries or not? We've got 5 people. It's not so great standing out in the cold. No, let's trust our luck.
Давай не будем. Может, пронесет.
They fought back 200 days at night. At that time, the defense of Stalingrad has exceeded all of the battles in world history. At first sight, an ordinary 4-story building, but it is well known all over the world as Pavlov's house. A sergeant, along with 2 other guardsmen, got a dangerous mission to get into the building, which was situated at the time several tens of meters from the Nazi positions, and construct an impregnable fortress. The house was taken. PT officer Kalinin was sent with a report to command, who were located in the Gerhard Mill across the street. This is the distance the fighter couldn't crawl in 3 days due to continuous battles. Meanwhile, local residents were in the basement of Pavlov's house. This 4-story building is a typical phenomena for military Stalingrad. Each building on neutral territory had to become a fortress. This is the building of the Central Department Store, in the basement of which, in January 1943, were the headquarters of the 6th Field German Army and its commander, Field Marshal Paulus, where he was captured. The House of the Red Army, the Regional Executive Committee, the House of the Air Force. These administrative buildings currently do not exist. The mill, where once saw located the command of the 13th Infantry Division, is still not destroyed. The architectural monument was carefully preserved in this ruined form. Bullets riddled every meter of the building, because the mill withstood not only a few direct airstrikes, but also regular attacks by the fascist troops. This was how the whole Stalingrad looked like. By mid-September 1942, the enemy destroyed 90% of all buildings and structures. The city turned into ruins, and black clouds hung in the air like a monument for hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Order, not a step back. There is no land beyond the Volga forest. And when the workers repaired the wrecked Red October tanks, and from the factory floor, they got behind the wheel and went into battle. That's something no one has ever known. The panorama Battle of Stalingrad shows us Mamayev Kurgan in January 1943. Here we can see the hero of the Soviet Union, sniper Vasily Zaitsev, tracking down an enemy in a hideout. To his left, the commander of the 62nd Army, Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov, gives orders. Literally a month later, the Red Army will capture the headquarters of the 6th Field German Army, led by its commander, Field Marshal Paulus. But in this retrospective, they don't know about it yet. For example, my grandfather already felt that there was no more strength to hold on. He even sent his brother Fyodor to the mainland with the last letter. The last letter was a farewell to his wife. He said, "If I die, send the letter. If I survive, destroy it." He survived. the letter was destroyed. We still don't know what was written in this letter. That is, he was ready to die. But even here, there is a photograph where the grandfather says that in order to take Stalingrad, the Germans had to kill all of us. The Germans didn't plan to spend so much time on the siege of the city. They had conceived a completely different war plan, lightning fast. By July 25th, this is just in 3 days, they should have captured Stalingrad. We have to try at all costs to capture the city, or at least to use our heavy weapons, so that the city loses its importance as a center of military industry and a communication center. Stalingrad was a major railway center, a port on the Volga. Through this river, oil products were transported. Indeed, this artery was very important. Therefore, the city was decided to be captured. But at that time, neither Paulus nor Hitler expected the rear center to become a stumbling block on their conquest map. Many historians notice that the Nazis lost the war here.
Hitler
said we will also supply by air. But these are the Stalingrad steppes. These are strong winds. Therefore, the air supply simply didn't work. The parachutes were demolished. They flew to our locations. The Germans were starving. They found it very hard there. The Brazilian people have traditionally well understood the importance of those military operations, of those historical events that took place on the Eastern Front in Russia for the fate of all mankind. It was well understood here that the fate of Brazil was decided there, at the Stalingrad walls. The victory in the Battle of Stalingrad was a great moment. They wrote about it in newspapers and magazines. Poets wrote poems about the victory of the Red Army.
Stalingrado, quantas esperanças, que flores, cristais e música, teu nome nos derrama, que felicidade brota de tuas casas. De uma apenas resta escada cheia de portas, de outra o cano de gás, a torneira, uma bacia de criança.
A poem by one of our greatest poets, Carlos Drummond de Andrade, by the name Letter to Stalingrad. In this poem, it describes a very dark, deadly, difficult, harsh environment. Many bodies, destruction, despair, gloom. But he did not stop there. He managed to project something else, a message of hope.
There were 3 great battles in 1942. Stalingrad, El Alamein, and the Battle of Midway in the Pacific. If El Alamein fell, the Germans would win in North Africa. So there were strong defenses put in place at El Alamein. It was a very narrow area. On the one side you had the sea, and on the other side you had the Qattara Depression. So you could only go through that narrow area to get to Cairo and the Suez Canal.
They love their land. They will stand for their land to the end. This is the most important thing for me. This is something I have learned for all the years of dealing with South African veterans. Their love for their homeland is comparable to ours. Some historians compare the Battle of El Alamein with the defense of Stalingrad, others with the tank battle of the Battle of Kursk. The battle on the Prokhorovsky field was larger in scale but similar in terms of strategy. The German army was not able to break through the Soviet defense and then to resist a counterattack. The enemy offensive begins. It is necessary to break through the defense. The brigade makes a breakthrough. The tank corps is injected into the breakthrough. It rushes forward for 100 to 200 kilometers. Adolf said it would be a rematch for Stalingrad. After all, what was so interesting? Our army lost the summer campaigns, but in winter we had total victories. And people started talking that Russians can fight only in winter, when a normal person doesn't feel comfortable. So we hit them in summer. And here we were fighting them and beating them in the summer. After the victories on the Soviet front, a series of successful operations of the Allied armies began. A new battle was being prepared in the Burmese-Indian region, which is called East Stalingrad. And everything happens in Kohima. The Japanese wanted to capture the city in order to prevent the Allied armies from entering Impala. Why were they so keen on this area? Barely a couple of thousand kilometers remained, and the Imperial Army would get to Delhi. At that time, an interesting song was composed in the army. They called it Bose's song. We'll go to Delhi, we'll capture Delhi. Delhi was something like a stronghold of British power. While another crucial battle was unfolding on the Eastern Front, Latin America formed an expeditionary force.
Brazil was a peaceful and rural country. From 100,000 Brazilian soldiers, we selected the 25,000 best men and sent them to fight in Italy.
Veterans remember that the snow was worse than the fascists. It was a real disaster for us to fight in winter when it was snowing. There are mountains in Brazil, but there is no snow there. Lots of soldiers at the time had never seen snowdrifts. Brazilian officers were trained in the United States before the war. They trained in the mountains, but there also was no snow there.
To those weather conditions. That is perhaps why some people compare the Battle of Stalingrad with the Battle of Monte Castello.
The last major battle for the Brazilians was the Battle for Montes. This was a strategically important point that gave the Allied forces a free hand.
A small town, a little town in the Apennines Hill in Italy, and it was the battle that the major number of lost, dead and wounded in Brazil.
At the end of war, on April 30, they managed to capture the 148th Division of Wehrmacht, which fought at Stalingrad. The heroes of this film were fortunate. They returned from the front alive. Gu Hansheng learned about the end of the war in the mountains of Yunnan. The American fighters told him the good news. Joe Wilkinson witnessed the surrender of the German submarines.
It was really something because U-boats popping up all over the place. And they used to fly a big black flag.
And Konstantin Sharov celebrated this day in Germany. We reached the banks of the Elbe on the 5th and settled in a pine forest. And then the driver comes a little drunk and says, "Kostya, they made peace." We promised each other not to let such a war happen ever again. It was a threat to the whole civilized world. It is very important to remember and to understand correctly, because the rewriting of history is taking place around the world today. Winners write history. It's a popular belief today. After all, if only 75 years later we argue who won World War II, then what would happen in 200 years or 1,000 years later? Every year I make reports about the People's March of Memory, which is called the Immortal Regiment. It takes place in 115 countries. The human river with banners flows through the streets of Rio de Janeiro and through the streets of Beijing. In those countries, there was never such direct participation. It's easy to erase that memory. Because we all won the war together, and not just the United States and Great Britain, as some people believe, including some residents of Brazil. We need a history where literally every day of the war is described. That's when we will realize the greatness of the feat and the greatness of the tragedy and what really happened. This research was a real discovery for me. I think those who watched the film through also learned a lot. Stalingrad is not just the name of the city or the designation of the major battle. It is a symbol of the world military history, a symbol of fear, blood and death, courage and bravery, a symbol of World War II. As long as we know and remember that each country has survived its own Stalingrad, new Stalingrad will not happen.
Стреляй, командир. Чё ждем?
Где подкрепление? Да связи нет! Мы будем стоять до конца.
The symbol of courage and unity in the face of the war.
Stalingrado, quantas esperanças. Flores, cristais e música, o teu nome nos diz. A felicidade brota de tuas asas.
Чтобы немцы взять Сталинград, они должны были перебить нас всех до одного.
Поэтому европейский журналист и автор нескольких бестселлеров Питер Хармсон называет оборону Шанхая Сталинградом на Янцзы.
Overall, if you look at the importance, the symbolic value of the battle, then I think there are similarities.
Японцы убивали каждого, кто попадался на пути, пока не уничтожили всех.
People simply knew very little, or really in some cases nothing, about China's involvement.
Я участвовал в наступлении на Мэйдхилу. Это был центральный фронт на территории Бирмы.
The Indian army was involved in running these supply convoys through Iran into Russia.
We did study the Second World War, but only very minimally.
У нас, к сожалению, историю знают отвратительно. У нас забыто буквально все.
Weather terrible. It was North Atlantic. It was really bad.
At 12 o'clock it was so hot you couldn't touch the stones next to you.
There's nothing you can do. I mean, except pray.
Пулями изрешечен каждый метр здания. Ведь мельница выдержала не только несколько прямых авиаударов, но и регулярные атаки фашистской армии. И так выглядел весь Сталинград.
We had also our battles. And now so important for us, like Stalingrad, BRICS.
Любовь к родине у них сравнива с нашей.
Я надену медали, так как буду говорить на камеру. Все должно быть аккуратно. Подожди, вот они.
Ночью что делать? Будем часового выставлять или нет? Давай не будем. Может, пронесет?